Welcome to News of the World, where we cover all of the most important stories from the previous month. This is our report for January 2018. In today's episode, Italy's newly dissolved parliament, continued Latin American fallout from the Petrobras and Odebrecht scandals, and newly discovered security flaws in the microchips that run most of the world's computers. But we begin today with politics in the United States of America. The President of the United States saw the completion of his first year in office this month. Last year closed out with his party facing a series of rebukes, losing 2 elections for state governor in Virginia and New Jersey, and an important by-election for the United States Senate to replace now Attorney General Jeffrey Sessions. This in the Republican heartland of Alabama. The victorious candidate, Senator Doug Jones, is the first Democrat Alabamans have elected to the Senate in almost 30 years. In more recent days, the United States national government staved off calamity after a brief shutdown. A compromise on the national budget was agreed upon in the legislature. Wrangling over immigration had been the primary stumbling block, with the rollback of the so-called DACA program, which afforded people brought illegally into the United States as children legal status and the right to work. This hurdle was overcome in a pattern often seen since the 1980s, by cutting taxes and greatly increasing spending, and piled the compromise onto the national debt to be dealt with by some future generation of more responsible officials. To add to these difficulties in the legislature, a firestorm was set off just prior to the initial shutdown, with the publishing of a book detailing the inner workings of the first 100 days of the Trump administration. This has caused increased infighting among the president's allies, as the list of senior people fired from the White House continues to grow in unprecedented fashion. Staying with the U.S. for a moment. On December 22nd, the President of the United States signed into law a large change to the U.S. tax code. This is the most substantial restructuring of the country's tax code in the last couple of decades. The largest changes were to the tax on corporate profits. The headline rate was reduced from 35% to 21%, with an additional one-time dispensation for firms which repatriate overseas profits. This has additional significance because the United States has long been an oddity in that they tax firms headquartered within the country for profits accrued both within the U.S. and abroad. Almost every other nation on Earth only taxes firms for profits made within their borders. This peculiarity has long led American multinationals to keep foreign profits abroad so as to avoid the additional tax burden of bringing them back to the U.S., and has even led some firms to move their headquarters abroad. This has been especially prevalent in the pharmaceutical industry, which has seen a rash of firms undergoing reverse mergers to move their headquarters to low-tax jurisdictions such as Ireland. The largest immediate impact of these changes has been to, counterintuitively, greatly increase the tax outlay of many financial institutions. The largest U.S. banks have had to make billions of dollars in write-downs. This is due to the fact that they hold losses from previous years as assets, known as deferred tax assets, which allow them to reduce their future tax burdens. Reducing the tax rate they will pay in future simultaneously reduces the value of these assets and their potential future tax savings. This will harm their profitability for 2017 and reduce what they pay for that year's taxes, with Goldman Sachs taking a write-down of $5 billion and Citigroup taking an astonishing estimated hit of $20 billion. On the other side of this one-time loss in tax revenue is a one-time windfall coming from the repatriation of prior overseas earnings. Apple intends to repatriate over $200 billion, paying some $38 billion in taxes. And many of the same financial institutions which are now taking asset write-downs will be paying north of $1 billion to do the same. Long term, it is unclear what the impact of this change in tax policy will entail. It is deeply unpopular with the general populace and the opposition Democratic Party. It also stands as the sole policy achievement of the first year of the Trump administration, and thus can be expected to play a central role in the upcoming 2018 midterm elections that will surely act as a referendum on the presidency and policy direction of the new-look Republican Party. United States foreign policy also started out the year tensely, suspending most sorts of military aid to Pakistan, immediately costing the country at least $2 billion. This was in retaliation for what is perceived as a lack of effort to eliminate terrorist groups that are fighting the United States across Pakistan's northern border in Afghanistan. This move echoes earlier $800 million and $300 million suspensions of aid in 2011 and 2016 under the previous U.S. administration. Later in the month, the United States also suspended a $65 million payment to the UN Relief and Workers Agency, which provides aid to many Palestinians. This was ostensibly due to a belief that the Palestinian authorities are not negotiating for peace in good faith. But with roughly half of the 2 million people in the Gaza Strip reliant on the agency for basic foodstuffs, the cuts will be felt deeply by the population. Turning to politics in Europe now. Catalonia is either a wealthy region of northeastern Spain or a distinct nation and people with its own language and history, unduly restrained and dominated by the Castilian powers in Madrid. Whichever narrative you ascribe to, the last 2 months have been full of interest, tension, and intrigue. The Catalonian regional government has been seeking a Scottish-style independence referendum for several years now, a move which has been consistently denied by Spain's national government. On October 1st, 2017, Catalonia's regional government, also known as the Generalitat, held an independence referendum anyway. This was met harshly by the national authorities. While some people were arrested and there was limited violence, a large portion of the population made it to the polls, and the vote was overwhelmingly in favor of independence. However, since the election was deemed illegal by Madrid, most people who supported remaining within Spain stayed away from the polls. After the tumultuous proceedings, the leader of the Generalitat determined that it was a victorious vote for independence that was being suppressed, and so he and the regional legislature unilaterally declared independence. A move that led the national government to arrest many separatist leaders, something that the leader of the separatists, Carles Puigdemont, escaped only by fleeing to Brussels. The events of October have been further complicated by a new regional election held in December to replace the arrested previous government that, with record turnout, returned the separatists and Mr. Puigdemont the largest share of the vote and control of the Catalan government. Mr. Puigdemont appears intent upon resuming his position in the government, though he would be arrested if he returned to Spain. It is unclear if he will attempt to govern from Belgium or if the separatists will strike some sort of compromise with the national government to restore order and stability to Spain. Italy's president dissolved its national parliament in January, with the new election to be held on the 4th of March. The ruling center-left Democratic Party managed to survive their entire 5-year term, even with the fractured state of Italian politics and having to move between 3 different prime ministers. The economy has been on the upswing of late, but with the continuing strife surrounding unlawful migration into the country, several populist and conservative parties are likely to pick up seats, making majority rule in the government unlikely. The populist Five Star movement currently leads the polls with 28% support, and may see their first opportunity in government. They would then have to prove their professionalism and ability to govern. On December 26, Liberia offered the world some encouraging news. They managed the first democratic transfer of power from one elected president to another since 1944. The outgoing president and Nobel Peace Prize winner, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, gave us a great deal to admire. She's widely respected as one of the only women to hold power in the continent and for bringing a more honest and technocratic approach to the politics of the small West African nation. Her background at the UN served her well. She maintained peace and stability, though she was unable to rid the country of rampant low-level corruption. Her vice president, 72-year-old Joseph Boakai, was resoundingly defeated in the second round of the presidential election on December 26th by a former professional football player who played for AC Milan and Paris Saint-Germain, who obtained 63% of the vote. This footballer-turned-president, George Weah, is widely admired by the populace for his athletic achievements, and his inexperience seems almost an asset because of the perception that he is not a corrupt, bribe-taking part of the existing system. Mr. Weah has been a senator since 2014, but despite his popularity, it's very uncertain what he will pursue or what kind of leader he will be. In his time in the Senate, he sponsored no legislation and was generally not very active. Liberia has done well after the civil wars, not yet 20 years past, to maintain a stable government and hold safe, free elections. Now the more complicated task of governing comes, and the country hopefully, if uncertainly, moves into the next phase. Moving on from the world of politics now. The sexual abuse scandals that have dominated cultural conversations throughout 2017 continued to spiral out and extend their tendrils into new countries and industries this month. In China, the initial fallout from this situation has been at universities. Faculty at no fewer than 68 universities have been implicated. After initial resistance by university administrations and within the Chinese Communist Party, some small steps have started to be taken, with the removal of several serially offending faculty. This movement began with some Chinese who are currently living in California. They've said that they felt that they were much safer being out of the country and didn't have to face the possible consequences of challenging powerful men in the universities. There was also resolution in the trial of Larry Nassar, the former United States Olympic gymnastics team doctor. After testimony by over half of the 265 victims of the longtime pedophile, he was given a sentence long enough that it might as well have been a life sentence. These situations both highlight that much of this abuse, while being perpetrated by a small minority of people in power, has been fostered by a staggering asymmetry in the power of abusers and the abused. Hopefully, once this process of catharsis and public abhorrence has concluded, our society will be poised to move forward beyond this sort of behavior. In technological news, a major revelation about the security of the microchips that power the world's computers came to light recently. Intel managed to keep the finding under wraps, and luckily for the firm, the vulnerabilities don't seem to have caused too much damage as of yet, because there is speculation about the firm's possible liability for the vulnerabilities. While these flaws are extremely difficult to exploit, they have the potential to affect almost all modern computers, but they create the largest threat for cloud-based services like Amazon Web Services. The essential problem is that people without permission to access certain files on a computer can use these weaknesses to attain data that they're supposed to be barred from. The upshot of this is that if there is only one user on a computer, it is vastly safer than if there are many. These vulnerabilities have come to be called Spectre and Meltdown. Processors make simple calculations, but they can make billions of these every minute. However, processors need to access information elsewhere on the computer in order to know what to calculate. This action is extraordinarily slow compared to the speed of the processor's calculations. So processors have been, for decades now, designed to guess what the data might be and calculate the results for several likely outcomes. Do the calculations while waiting to find out what the data actually is, and then discard the wrong calculations for the incorrect guesses. This concept is called speculative execution. It is not normally a problem and greatly increases the performance of computers. The problem with this arises when the data the processor is checking answers the question of whether or not the user has access to the data in question. It will make calculations and fetch data that is supposed to be inaccessible, and while this is almost instantly discarded, people have shown the ability to figure out what data has been accessed, thereby stealing the supposedly secret information. This is all very complicated, but suffice it to say that the ramifications of this discovery will reverberate for years to come, and will likely force firms with tens of thousands of data centers like Google or Amazon to re-outfit their servers with less vulnerable processors, sacrificing performance and potentially costing billions of dollars. Turning now to the world of business. The European Union followed up their antitrust action against Google, which saw a fine of $2.7 billion last June, and suit against Ireland, forcing Apple to pay an additional $13 billion in taxes there this month, with a judgment against Qualcomm, a chip maker, that, if their appeal fails, will cost the firm $1.2 billion. This is all part of a more concerted effort on the behalf of EU regulators to limit the ever-increasing market power of American technology and internet firms. These efforts are led by the European Commissioner for Competition, Margrethe Vestager, who has taken a highly active stance in recent years. Many people across the Atlantic feel that the particular attention being paid to American firms and the general dearth of European technology champions has led to never far off European tendencies for protectionism. But the fact that the United States government has also fined Qualcomm and attempted to change the tax practices of firms like Apple speak to the broad validity of at least some of the EU's moves. Antitrust authorities have had a busy time on both sides of the Atlantic lately. The last few years have seen substantial increases in industry consolidation across the globe, with near-record mergers and acquisitions and more cross-border mergers than have ever been seen. China has been at the forefront of this, lavishing money on all kinds of firms in Europe and America. The mood of regulators seems to have cooled on these sorts of enormous mergers. In Britain, the proposed merger of 21st Century Fox and Sky, the country's largest paid TV network, has been put on hold due to concerns over the power of the Murdoch family on media in the country. With the sale of Fox to Disney, the world's largest media firm, for $66 billion on December 14th, the decision about Sky seems likely to be reversed. The emergent behemoth this series of deals will create is likely to be allowed by US and British regulators. In stark contrast to this, the proposed purchase of US telecoms giant AT&T for $85 billion by media conglomerate Time Warner is likely to be blocked by US regulators. This is highly unusual, since traditionally, American regulators allowed substantial mergers to create vertically integrated firms, and frowned upon horizontal consolidation, which allows for two-direction market pressure to be exerted, both on suppliers to lower prices and customers raising prices. So the horizontal acquisitions by Disney in past eras would have faced more opposition than the vertical acquisition of Time Warner. It is also unclear if the overall acceptance of large-scale mergers may be cooling, or if the limits placed upon telecoms firms will be more industry-specific. Certainly China's government has sought to stem the outflow of capital from their shores through acquisitions after enormous growth over the previous decade. And it seems very likely that the wave of populist sentiment that has taken hold throughout the rich world in the last several years will lead to increasing protectionist and nationalist policy. With the close of the year, fourth quarter earning reports from the world's most prominent firms have come out. Amazon saw a record quarter with revenues of over $60 billion, a 38% jump year on year, and net income more than doubling to almost $2 billion. Apple also saw record fourth quarter revenues of $52.6 billion. This is on the back of substantial price increases for iPhones and strong growth in revenue from services and peripheral devices, both of which grew in the 30 to 40% range. These strong numbers align with the broad trend toward higher profit margins for many of the world's largest firms. In a less optimistic turn of events, General Electric, one of the world's largest and oldest industrial firms, continued its extensive house cleaning under its new CEO, John Flannery, by taking a $9.5 billion write-down on long-term reinsurance contracts. Upon this news, the firm's stock price took a 3% hit, which furthered the 40% drop it has faced over the last year as it's undertaken extensive reorganization and retrenchment. There is speculation about the potential of the firm to be broken up. Turning now to the broader economic situation. The rich world has seen continuing drops in unemployment and broad economic growth through the close of the year. United States unemployment is at 4.1%, the lowest since the financial crisis, and the European Union's unemployment has been dropping quickly, now 8.7%. As welcome as this news may be, Europe's general job growth obscures vast divergence throughout the region, with German unemployment reaching record lows of 3.6%, while Greece continues to languish with over 20% unemployment. The whole region's situation is improving, but still at a much slower pace along the Mediterranean coast. Returning to politics for a moment, the aftershocks of Brazil's enormous series of corruption scandals continued last Christmas when Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, the president of Peru, pardoned an earlier president, Alberto Fujimori, who was imprisoned because of corruption and human rights abuses during his rule from 1990 to 2000. This was ostensibly done for humanitarian reasons due to the poor and deteriorating health of Mr. Fujimori, but appears to have been a political move. The pardon came just 3 days after an impeachment vote by Peru's Congress. In the failed vote, 10 opposition legislators, including Kenji Fujimori, the former president's son, abstained and thus protected the current president. This connects to Brazil because President Kuczynski and others associated with him had business connections to Odebrecht, the firm at the center of the enormous scandal engulfing more and more of Latin America. Once these connections emerged, while no wrongdoing was established, a move for impeachment immediately began, led by the daughter of the imprisoned Mr. Fujimori, who also sits in Congress and now leads the party her father founded. The tag team efforts of Mr. Fujimori's children seem to have secured their father's freedom, but this has also caused outrage throughout the country, with thousands joining protests against what they see as the impunity of criminal elites and government corruption. President Kuczynski was largely elected because of a rising wave of opposition to the Fujimori clan's enduring prominence, and being seen to cave in before them stands in direct opposition to the wishes of his electoral base. On another front of these seemingly endless scandals, the leading likely candidate in Brazil's upcoming election, former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, had his conviction of corruption upheld by an appellate court on January 26th. His hand-picked successor and protege, Dilma Rousseff, was ousted as president at the start of her second term because of the enormity of the scandals that have shaken the entire continent. Her removal left a hole in the party's leadership, and Lula is currently leading in the polls. However, if the unanimous ruling against Lula stands, he will be barred from seeking election, a law that he himself enacted. This ruling will then likely be taken to Brazil's Supreme Court. Looking forward into 2018, the electoral treadmill continues, as always. Latin America faces elections with potentially enormous ramifications. Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, Venezuela, Paraguay, and Costa Rica all face general elections that could completely change the political landscape of the region. Latin America, the erstwhile home of populism, has largely withstood the populist surge seen in Europe and the United States since 2015, with moderate conservative reformers taking power in Peru and Argentina, and the center-left holding sway in Chile. But considering the continuing fallout from Brazil's Odebrecht and Petrobras scandals across South America, and the worsening economic outlook of the last few years, it seems all too likely that the populists may surge ahead. The most important elections to watch for are in Brazil and Mexico, the two most populous countries and largest economies in the region. The very stability of government and maintenance of the rule of law in Brazil depend upon the smooth execution and good result of the election. Mexico faces an only slightly less dire threat from the surging leader of the populist left, Manuel López Obrador. The unpopularity of the conservative incumbent, Enrique Peña Nieto, who cannot stand again, is likely to hurt whoever the candidate from his institutional revolutionary party ends up being. In addition to the high stakes in Brazil and Mexico, the Venezuelan government faces its potential last gasps this year. After recently defaulting on its substantial national debts, seeing large-scale protests in the streets, food shortages, and the worst hyperinflation on the planet, the regime's days seem to be numbered. This year will see both parliamentary and presidential elections. If the regime resorts to the same kind of repressive techniques they've begun increasingly using in the last few years to keep President Maduro in power, the regime will lose its last semblance of legitimacy and may face mounting pressure by the other members of the Mercosur regional grouping to concede to reformers. The rest of the region has been hesitant to involve itself too much in the internal politics of any particular member, but the rising humanitarian strife and potential destabilizing effect on Venezuela's neighbors may prove too much for the other nations in the club to remain silent. On a more somber note, great people die every day. We have the opportunity to honor but a few here at News of the World. This month, we look back upon the life of Peter Sutherland. This great Irishman, often known as the father of globalization, served as the Director General of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, as well as the Director General of the World Trade Organization. Before holding these posts, he founded the Erasmus program that has allowed for millions of university students to study in different countries across Europe. He did much to create the rules-based trade system that is so relied upon by every society on Earth. And so today, we salute him, Peter Sutherland. Okay, now let's turn to the whiz-bang humdinger finish. Talks between Presidents Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un on the Korean Peninsula resumed this month. This has been prompted by the escalation of tensions between the US and North Korean presidents. Some athletes from the North will be allowed to compete in the upcoming Winter Olympics in the South. While this is just a token gesture, it is at least a step back toward a non-military status quo. South Korea's chaebol have long been the engine of South Korea's economic growth. However, there has been growing resentment toward them due to the widespread perception that they are given unfair advantages by the government, and that many of the families see themselves as above their countrymen. This came to a head in 2017 when Conservative President Park Geun-hye was removed in a corruption scandal involving the largest chaebol. Korea's Fair Trade Commissioner, Kim Song-jo, looks well placed to bring many of these firms to heel. Korea's largest firms have long flouted the laws of their land. If Mr. Kim is successful, then these firms may belatedly emerge as normal and might even find the substantial Korean discount somewhat reduced. Turkey has seen GDP growth of over 11% in 2017. This is a surprisingly good turn of events considering the massive disturbances of the war to its south and the purges of the civil service, educational system, and military that followed the previous year's coup attempt. As welcome as this turn of events is, it has largely been fostered with wildly loose monetary policy that has caused the lira to lose 40% of its value against the dollar over the last 2 years, and over 13% inflation over the course of 2017, leaving the country in a precarious state moving forward. Iran has seen widespread mobilization and political protests this month, with many protesters clamoring for governmental change in the person of the president. In contrast to the protests of 2009, these protests appear to revolve around the economic situation, including high unemployment and inflation. They emanated from smaller cities and towns throughout the western half of the country, and were made up of people who tend to be more conservative, as opposed to the wealthy elites that led the early protests. The demonstrations were met with harsh repression, seeing at least 20 dead and many more injured. These strategies seem to have been effective and curtailed the public protests, though it remains to be seen whether the underlying grievances will fester and reemerge or not. For the first time since 1957, there was not a single passenger jet plane crash in 2017. Considering the rapid growth of the industry, which flew approximately 37 million flights in 2017, this is an impressive and encouraging realization. Alright, that's all we've got for January 2018. We'll see you next month. Feel free to like this video if you learned something, or subscribe here for updates on everything we do. And as always, don't forget to think.